Good evening and welcome, dear friends, to this third session of the 2022 Turner Winter Series, now in its 17th year and now being held in the spacious comfort of the Robert H. Jackson Center here in Jamestown. I'm Maureen Raveno. Whether you are here in person watching through the live streaming system or if you are joining us later via YouTube, it is my great pleasure to begin our time together with a brief introduction of our timely and interesting guest, Arthur Stewart, after which Arthur will give a PowerPoint presentation to preview the topic this evening, which will then initiate the conversation between Arthur and our perennial host and the founder of this series, Jamestown's and the Jackson Center's own Greg Peterson. So let me first say a few words to begin to get to know and to appreciate Arthur Stewart. Arthur Stewart, founder of Cameron Energy, located in Clarendon, Pennsylvania, has been in oil and gas production for 34 years, producing natural gas to supply 15,000 households with 100,000 plus barrels of oil per year through the operation of 1,650 wells in northwest Pennsylvania. Of note is that Cameron Energy was recently featured in September of 2021 in an hour-long special on Fox Business News titled How America Works with Mike Rowe. Arthur is the former owner and founder of DNI Silica, which was the largest independent provider of hydrofracture sand during the first 10 years of the Marcellus Shale natural gas well development. Retired from the practice of law with a focus on municipal oil and gas, his community involvements have been with the Salvation Army Board for 30 years, the United Way Fund for 20 years, his local school board for 15 years, the Allegheny Forest Alliance for 30 years, the Pennsylvania Grade Crude Oil Coalition for 10 years, and for 5 years as the governor's appointee to the Pennsylvania Crude Oil Development Advisory Council. In the rest of his life, he has been married to Susan Stewart for 39 years, and together they have raised 4 children, 3 of whom are employed full-time at Cameron Energy. Arthur is an alum of Allegheny College, as fellow alum Greg Peterson will no doubt point out, and the University of Pittsburgh School of Law as well. So now, let's all relax and enjoy the kind of informative and insightful conversation and presentation that is the hallmark of Greg's great 17 Turner Years Series interviews. But first, please welcome Arthur Stewart to provide some background. Arthur?
Wind and solar coming on as gangbusters. What percentage are they taking of our energy picture now? Is our fossil fuel reliance going up or down, especially with the wind and solar coming on? Are fossil fuels finite? The question I began to ask 22 is going up or down, especially with the wind and solar coming on. Are fossil fuels finite? The question I began to ask 22 years ago. If so, how do we measure that? And are there any limitations on wind and solar? So before we get to those larger questions, let's come down to the personal. This is energy in terms we understand. If we got on the bicycle and we pedaled at a maintainable pace, we would be able to generate about 100 watts of electricity an hour. And to put that in terms that we understand with respect to the gas station analogy that I was throwing out, if you pedaled for 330 hours, that's about the energy equivalent of what's born in 1 gallon of gasoline. And if we think a gallon of gasoline's value, we think about $3. That's what it is if you take out the road taxes. And so our pedaling, our manual labor is worth roughly about a penny an hour if we value it in the terms of what we pay for gasoline. This is depicting an air conditioner, and if you count the number of people that I have on the stationary bicycles, this is roughly 40 people, and that's about what it takes to run an air conditioner. And we pay about 40 cents a kilowatt hour for the electricity that comes to our homes. And so once again, we see that penny an hour formula borne out here. We're going to pay 48 cents an hour to the electricity company, or we'll pay 48 cents to this group of 40 people to run the air conditioner. And this is my favorite. Obviously, there's about 100 people here, and that's about the energy that the average American consumes every minute of every hour, of every day, of every month, of every year, represented by those 100 people pedaling. All of this to make the point that we don't see that energy as we take the walk down the valley every day, but it is an enormous amount. So we're going to switch gears and talk about where we harvest energy. And I mentioned early on the concept of growing renewables, wind and solar. And you can see this is depicting the meteoric rise, if you will, from 2000 to roughly the current date. And the blue represents wind and the yellow represents solar, and the bottom would be essentially biofuels, ethanol, and so forth. And the rise has been tremendous. But how does that stack up in the bigger picture of all the energy that we consume around the world? That's depicted in this graph. And the renewables, wind and solar and biofuels, are the brown at the very top. Hydroelectricity is the blue, nuclear is the next one down. And then the real kings of the hill remain fossil fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas. And today, the fossil fuels still produce 84% of the energy that we consume around the world. So they have been and they remain kings of the hill. And the dent that renewables are putting in that are not truly significant, at least yet at this stage. Now, take notice that this is a very current graph from BP, British Petroleum. And you can see the drop in COVID. This goes through the year 2000. I will tell you that in 2021, we have essentially rebounded to where we were pre-COVID. And so as the statistics closed out in the end of 2021, we had basically scrambled back in terms of energy consumption to where we had been prior to the advent of COVID. What's interesting is this doesn't look that abnormal or unusual in terms of human history, but if we draw the scale out to a longer time period, let's go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Whoop. This is also from BP, and this is up through 2018, just before COVID. But you'll see the meteoric rise of energy consumption in toto, and it is absolutely astounding that up in 1800, if you will, at the left, all of humanity was consuming the relatively small amount on the left, and throughout the Industrial Revolution and with population growth, this is the total of what we're consuming, and the renewables are a very small part of it at the top. Again, this depicts not only the growth, but the fossil fuels remain, if you will, king of the hill. So let's turn our attention to problems in the energy orchard, if you will. And I'm going to focus on two things. We'll start off with the one fossil fuel, oil, and we'll start there because that's primarily my business. That's the business I'm in, and it's the one that most fascinates me out of the three fossil fuels. And then we'll move on to wind and solar after that. And this is an odd thing perhaps to call a problem, but I want to point out that we're dependent on oil for 90% of the world's transportation needs. And why do I term that a problem in the energy orchard? I think realistically, we're going to have to acknowledge that it's going to be very difficult to transition away from oil for transportation. And we might think of electric cars as being defeatist of the notion that I put out there, but actually personal transportation is a very small percentage of the world's overall transportation needs. When you think of the global economy and the massive ships that are moving, we're not going to be able to power those ships, those critical things that move our goods and our raw materials, with anything other than oil, because batteries would consume the greater portion of the cargo, even if you could tackle the problem of how to relatively rapidly charge such a massive fleet of batteries. I'll talk later about Professor Vaclav Smil. I believe he's from the University of Manitoba. He's a great author, and he talks extensively about this. The research is not mine, but Professor Smil is marvelous at making the point that there are physical limitations on what batteries can do. And so the same is true with airplanes. Even if you have test airplanes and we see them pedaled by pedal power or pedaled by electricity, when we try to scale that for a transport plane for cargo or for human beings, we have to think of, again, the physical limitations. A plane that takes off can't land at the same weight. It can only land at about 60% of the weight or less that it took off with, because the landing gear and the runway won't support it. So if you take off with batteries, you can't land with those batteries, because as they deplete, they don't lose weight in that depletion. So besides the fact that you can't store enough batteries on an airplane, you would not be able to land with it. And so for those large portions of our transportation needs, we're going to be wedded to oil. Did I skip a slide? Yes, I skipped a slide. Okay, here we go. Next problem in the energy orchard. This answers one of the questions that I posed initially. Where are we with energy consumption and fossil fuel consumption? And is it going down? The answer for oil is definitively no. We're growing in our consumption of oil at about 1 million barrels a year. And I've read with fascination the concept that's developed over the last few years of peak oil demand, not peak oil supply, but the peak in the demand of oil. And I find it fascinating that so many articles are written about that without a scintilla's worth of evidence that we're slowing down on our demand for oil. And we have to look at the globe when we think about demand for energy and recognize, first of all, that there's about 1.5 billion people on Earth that have no electricity. And then the enormous places where energy is being consumed is not the United States in terms of growth. The United States is the largest consumer in most respects, quantitatively, and almost the largest per capita. But where the real growth is occurring would be in China and India, with roughly 3 billion people scattered around that part of the world. China's energy consumption per capita is still very low, about 1/6 of what we consume here in the United States, and there's still a lot of room for growth and a lot of room for demand there. And as I look at that and I think about people with no electricity whatsoever, I ask the question, where is the evidence? What is the genesis for the notion that we're going to be peaking in our demand for energy in general, as well as oil or fossil fuels in particular? Problems in the energy orchard. This is a picture of my son picking cherries up along Lake Erie. What it's intended to conjure in our minds is the notion of where are we picking the fruit on the tree. And obviously we all pick fruit at the bottom of the tree first, and then we have to drag out the ladders and the lifts to get to the top. And where are we with respect to oil and fossil fuels? With respect to oil, I would submit to us that we're no longer picking the low-hanging fruit. When we think about being in the deep water of the Gulf of Mexico as our most likely places for future exploration, or when we're talking about going to the Arctic and the extremely difficult conditions of working at negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit, that suggests to me that we're looking for oil at the top of the tree and not the low-hanging fruit. So I qualify that as a problem. And I think that problem is borne out beautifully by this chart. What this chart represents is a picture of where our oil is produced in terms of formations, if you will, from 2005, from 1980, I believe, to the current time. But the significance is what happened in 2005. And the large gray at the bottom of the chart is conventional oil. And by conventional, we mean the places where we found it since Drake drilled in 1859. And where Drake found oil was in the storage zones, which are generally sandstone or limestone. And that's the places to where the oil migrated from its formation zones, which were the shale zones, which were deeper in the Earth's crust. So for the first 150 plus years of the oil industry, we learned how to drill into, target, stimulate, and remove from those storage zones what we came to call conventional oil. We knew very early on about the shale formations where oil and gas were formed. In fact, we drilled through them many decades ago, and they would make a show of natural gas and a show of oil, but they were not harvestable because the shale is so tight that it would not willingly give up the molecules of oil and gas freely, and hence it wasn't economical to try to draw from those shale sand, or from those shale formations, the oil and gas that was contained therein. So what's really significant other than the gray on this is the tan, which represents U.S. shale oil. And it is in the shale oil and in the tar sands of Canada that we almost exclusively have growth in oil production from 2005 to the current date. Well, why is that significant? Because our oil demand is still going up. And I think it's highly relevant to examine where is that coming from. It's coming exclusively from these very energy-intensive shale zones, or the energy-intensive tar sand practice up in Canada, where they're actually mining bitumen and heating it and then adding it to conventional oil to make a saleable product. So these things take a lot of energy. There's a lot of cost associated with it. And this is where we get the super hydrofractures that have been in the news for the last 20 years. We're hydrofracturing the shale to make those oil and gas molecules come to the wellbore. Now, hydrofracturing is not a new thing. The first well was hydrofractured in Warren County in 1963, but the application of it on this very wide base with enormous amounts of fluid and enormous amounts of pressure is what is not qualitatively new, but quantitatively new in the shale. And that's what has yielded this enormous growth in oil production in the United States. So in 2005, the United States was producing something on the order of 5 million barrels a day of oil, which is about half of the oil that the United States produced at its peak back in the early 1970s. But over the course of the next handful of years, the United States grew to about 13 million barrels a day of oil production, a whopping 8 to 9 million barrels a day of that coming from the shale sands, making the United States the world's largest oil producer on the backs of this shale formation. It is an astounding story, but there's a dark underbelly to the story, if you will. And let's go there. The truth of the matter is, the shale industry, at least on the oil side, has never been profitable. It was driven on the backs of investors who essentially lost their shirts. And it was interesting, back when the shale development began, I was buoyed by that. I was very happy because we knew how expensive it was. Remember what I said about it being energy intensive. You have to bring in enormous amounts of water, enormous amounts of horsepower, enormous amounts of sand, which was very good for my business. That was the business that I was in, bringing rail cars of sand. At one point, we had 1,000 rail cars a day moving across the nation in just my business to bring sand to these massive hydrofracture operations. all of that costs money. And this is a chart from Bloomberg of the cash flow from shale oil from 2010 to the current date. And it's all negative. It's all below the line. And the reason that I was buoyed back in 2010 was I knew how much these wells cost, and to my company members I said, this is great news. Oil's never going to go below $75 or $85 or $100 a barrel again, because where all the new growth is coming from, it's whoppingly expensive, and we can drill wells cheaper than that in our conventional formations, and our table is set for the next several years. And boy, was I in for a rude shock when in 2015 the price of oil collapsed. It didn't collapse, though, on the fundamentals, I submit to you. I submit it collapsed because there was so much money being thrown at the shale development that they went on a spending spree. And profitability didn't matter as revealed by this. But I chalk this up to the category of problems in the energy orchard, because if you're not making money, it's not going to go on forever. And I think that's the reality that's unfolding literally in the news today as we see the price of oil go up. There's been a tightening of the belts in shale, and no one's investing in it unless there's a return to the investor. And so you see a completely different mindset coming out of the shale. So problems in the energy orchard really comes down to this slide for oil in my mind. And this slide reveals discoveries. And I think it's axiomatic that you can't produce what you haven't discovered. And there was a very fascinating gentleman, I don't have time to tell the story today. His name was M. King Hubbert, Hubbert. And if you have a chance to Google, it's a fascinating story. He was the chief geologist for the greatest oil company in the world. And he said that there was a relationship between discoveries and production, and that the discoveries would be here in time, and 40 years later, the production would track whatever was happening with the discoveries. So if discoveries were going up, then 40 years later, production would be going up, and the inverse would be true. And what do we see here with respect to discoveries? We see that discoveries were peaking in the 1960s, and we've been on a steady downslide since the 1960s. And at some point, you cross over the point where you're discovering less than you are producing. And so let's fast forward to the next slide, and we'll focus in on the current time, because I think it's pretty fascinating. This is a look at just the last 6 years. This is global oil discoveries, and take note that it's BOE, which is barrels of oil equivalent. That doesn't mean just oil. That means natural gas as well, and they're using a conversion factor of 6-to-1 MCFs to barrels to come up with the BOE equivalent. What I'm saying to you is the discovery that's shown here really isn't as good as it seems. And what we have in 2021 is the discovery of 4.7 billion barrels of new oil, which sounds like a lot. But what is that in relation to what we actually consume every year? We actually consume about 9 times or 8 times that amount. So we long ago crossed the threshold where we're discovering less than what we're producing. We're really living right now, we're consuming on the backs of the discoveries made long ago. That's why I categorize it as a problem in the patch. And is there a lot of spare capacity at OPEC? That seems to be the fallback thought, lots of spare capacity. Quick story on this slide. This depicts the reserves in OPEC, and those lines that jut up doesn't represent new discoveries at OPEC. It represents when they took over in OPEC their own fields, and they simply said, we have more oil than we used to. And the other thing that's significant, the reserves never go down. In Saudi Arabia, they just stay the same. But there haven't been any significant discoveries in this time frame, but there has been 10 million barrels a day of production. One would think it would come down a bit, and there are certainly authors out there who are highly skeptical of these numbers, yet if you pick up the popular press, you'll see, oh, well, there's plenty of spare capacity in OPEC. I look at different things than popular press. I look at inventories, and this is a picture of Saudi inventories, I find that rather significant. And finally, when we get to the end of the oil story, I think people are surprised to see the numbers. If you Google the question, when will we run out of oil? The answer pops up, 40 years. You know, well, how can that be? But we'll do the numbers quickly with me. This is a compilation from Wikipedia, which jives with other things that I look at in terms of EIA or IEA, so it was an easy place to grab this. And this is roughly the reserves from all the countries in the world, and I put the total down here at the bottom. You see it's roughly 1.5 trillion barrels of proved reserves that are left. We've consumed about 1.2 thereabouts so far in all of human history. So we haven't consumed quite half, and that seems like, first, that should be a lot left. But do the math with me quickly. At 100 million barrels a day consumption of oil, 365 days a year, that works out to about 36 billion barrels a year. I said oil, that's really liquids because there's a little bit of other biofuels and things in there to be perfectly accurate. But at 36 billion barrels a year, it takes you a little under 30 years to get to 1 trillion, and that doesn't account for any growth. So if we continue to have the growth we're talking about, then that arrives at the roughly 40-year figure. This is why I qualify this as a problem in the energy orchard. And the final thought that I'll close with is I've never seen an oil well that produces at, let's say, 10 barrels a day, the most you can get out of it, and it produces that way for 20 years, and then on the beginning of the 21st year, it suddenly goes off a cliff and quits producing. That's not the way an oil well works. My oil wells work like a bell curve. They go up and then they go down, and I think that's the way it works with oil production as well. So long before we get to that 41st year, we're going to see the other side of the bell curve. All right, that's it for oil. Not doing too badly on time. Let's go to, this is just an interesting site where you can go on and they have a running tally of it, but it just repeats what I said. Now let's go to wind and solar. That's what my W and S stands for. And the first thing I want to talk about is, what do wind and solar produce? They produce electricity, and so we have to be cognizant that electricity represents only about 1/3 of all the energy in our energy orchard. And there's an interesting site in Hawaii where the Hawaii state says, oh, we want to be 100% renewable by 2050. But they made a mistake on their website. As you dig into it, what they really mean is they want to have 100% of their electricity produced by wind and solar, but that's hardly 100% of the energy they consume in Hawaii. But that mistake is made time in and time out in articles that are in the popular press. Problems in the energy orchard would also, we'd be remiss if we didn't look at the fossil fuels that we use in the generation of the solar facilities and in their installation and in their operation. And that gentleman that I referred to before, Vaclav Smil, is the author of these figures that I provide you. But you can see enormous amounts of concrete, steel, which are all made with coal and oil. And then the oil required to create the carbon fibers that are used in the windmills, and not represented here would be the oil that's used in the installation and the trucks that go there to maintain and so forth. But here is what I think is the enormous problem that relates back to one of the questions that I posed at the beginning. Is there some kind of physical limitation on wind and solar? And I think the physical limitation that's overlooked is found here with respect to mineral reliance. The amount of items like copper, lithium, neodymium, did I say cobalt, other items that go into not only the electricity producers, but the electricity storers in the forms of batteries, the amount is enormous. I'll give you a quick example. A Tesla battery weighs about 1,000 pounds. It takes about 500,000 pounds of ore to produce that one Tesla battery. And this is a relatively benign site that is definitely not stilted toward fossil fuels, the IEA. And in the lower part of the chart, what they're talking about is the amount of minerals for offshore wind at the top, and you see that's the longest bar, and the shortest is natural gas. So by a large order of magnitude, the minerals that go into wind and solar exceed what our current energy orchard is used to. I'm not sure how we're going to find, let alone have the energy to mine all of that. And up at the top is the electric car, which we won't focus on, but has a similar representation. And then we have the acreage consumption. The solar panels, for example, this is a chart from Ohio, but it's meant to represent what would it take in terms of acreage to supply a city of 100,000 people. And we're talking about 241,000 solar panels, which takes roughly 3,000 acres, compared to the handful of acres it would take for a deep well, shale well, to produce the same amount of energy. And so we have to be cognizant, where are we going to come up with all of the space for these facilities? And we also have the not in my backyard problem. Germany has set a policy to have wind and solar extensively throughout the country, but they are embroiled in disputes where folks don't want these because of the shadow effect of wind turbines or the noise of wind turbines or the ice that they throw. And this is a fun site to go to. This is a graph from the United Kingdom. And at any moment in time, you can go to the United Kingdom or this website and see where electricity is being generated from in the United Kingdom. And the large orange or yellow is natural gas. So that's far and away where the UK is getting most of its power right now, which is a problem for them because the natural gas production from the North Sea has been in decline since the year 2000. So everybody in Europe is becoming more and more reliant upon the Russians. But what's interesting here is wind and solar. Wind is in the blue and solar is the yellow. And if you see that little white arrow that I put on there, I chose that very carefully. And I chose it to tilt the table against wind and solar. I'm showing you one of the worst days for wind and solar in the United Kingdom, but I'm showing it to you for a reason. And at that moment in time on that day, wind was only producing 1.37% of the United Kingdom's power, and the sun was producing 5.7, so roughly 7%. And I show that to you for this point. And it's the point that we always forget to talk about with wind and solar, and that is the failure of wind and solar to have their own storage ability. Because there's hundreds of billions of dollars put into the wind and solar installations in the United Kingdom, and at that moment in time, they only supplied 7%. And so what would it take to have wind and solar supply 100%? You would either have to have, help me with the math here, roughly 14 times the installations so that that number of 7% would increase to 100%, or you'd have to have some massive storage ability. And storage is a key that we forget about. Let's talk just briefly about storage. When you have the principle of energy density in mind, that's the amount of energy stored per unit of volume. And the beauty about fossil fuels is they come with built-in storage. Coal has energy density. A gallon of oil has energy density. Wind and solar have no energy density. There's nothing there except what's produced in the moment. The only way you have energy density is when you add to it the component of storage. And we have no means, realistically, of economical storage for electricity. We have the example of the Kinzhou Dam. That's a storage facility as well as a generator, but that's only about 1% of the dams around the world because they pump the water up to a man-made reservoir. But you think about the dam and all that went into it. It took 8 years to complete that facility from beginning to end. The dam was 5 years, and the generating facility was another 3 to get it all wrapped up. We're not able to build those in part because all the great sites are, not all the great sites, most of the great sites are used up, but then you have the not in my backyard notion. Then we're experimenting with things like compressed air or gravity storage, but those have not been scaled, and it's a very, very difficult problem. So you have hundreds of billions here to get 7%, but what do you do for the other 93%? You have to have some kind of backup, and right now that's fossil fuels. And this is Germany's experience. This is my friend Vaclav Smil, and this is such a great YouTube presentation that I stole part of it for tonight because I admire his work and I like this. So the top line represents capacity of electricity generation in Germany over a period 2000 to 2015. You see it stayed roughly the same. And then the line that starts down here on the lower left and climbs to meet the other line is the capacity to generate electricity in Germany from wind and solar. And you'll see it has grown to be equivalent to fossil fuel capacity in Germany over that 15 years. That is a very good thing, at least initially in our minds. And then the other line is actual electricity generation. So what do we have as we leave this slide? We have capacity that's the same with fossil fuels as it is with wind and solar. And what would you think the actual generation is? Should be 50-50. Here we go with the next slide. In fact, it's only 80-20. In fact, it's worse than 80-20. 80% of Germany's electricity here is coming from fossil fuels, and only 20% is coming from wind and solar. And that's because wind and solar don't generate at their capacity. They generate when the wind blows and when the sun shines. Wrapping up problems in the energy orchard would be the fact that wind turbines and solar panels are not forever. They have a limited life of about 20 years, but here's the point we don't talk about. What happens at year 10? Remember my bell curve? You're not going to have a Seneca cliff with the wind turbine producing flat out for 20 years. It's degrading in performance for the reasons shown here. And then we have the problems of decommissioning, which are too great to go into, but I put this slide here merely to remind us that there is no such thing as green energy. Every energy source has an impact upon the environment, from its construction to its operation with killing of birds, for example, with wind turbines, to how we dispose of things that really can't be recycled, like the carbon fiber blades. So my final reflections are these. What are the spoils of cheap, abundant energy? If we can just go back to the 30,000-foot view, I submit to you that cheap energy has been a wonderful thing for us, but we've become very spoiled. We've forgotten what it's like to do hand labor. 80% of us used to be farmers, and now 2% of us are in agriculture, and we lose the association with land, and we don't recognize the calories that it takes to bring the food to our table. There's about 10 calories of energy in every 1 calorie of food that we eat. In agriculture today, we put in 90 times the energy that we did just 100 years ago, and all that energy that we're putting in is fossil fuels. I'll throw out a question to you to think on, and I'll try to remember to come back to it. What's the source of fertilizer? Where does fertilizer come from? So I'll finish up with these other two questions, and then we'll answer that key question. If a growing supply of cheap energy is not readily at hand, what consequences are in store? I think this is a big-ticket item. If we think about gross domestic product, and we go back and we look at the supply of energy, those two are in lockstep, and they've always been in lockstep. And so if we lose a cheap supply of energy and it begins to go down the other side of the curve, I submit to you, I think GDP will do the same. And here we are sitting on $30 trillion of debt in this country, as well as debt around the world, and that's just one form of debt. That doesn't account for the Social Security and other debt. And debt is really a call on future energy. It's the assumption that energy will grow, that there will be more GDP, more money in the system in the future. And will that always be true? And if not, it's an interesting 30,000-foot question. What happens if your energy supply does begin to become more expensive, and what happens to GDP? Last, what's the best means to treasure our energy supply? I know that this sounded like 30 minutes of doom, and I want to leave us with this question. We, as the human species, are marvelous at adaptation, and I think if we're left free to use this incredible mind of ours that we will find solutions. But what is the policy to find those solutions? Right now we have governments around the world that are very involved in telling us what is the right answer. And I submit to us, I don't think the government is the best at picking winners and losers, but I do think that losers are very good at picking government. And I think we can find a lot of examples where government has said this is the policy to go, and it's been an enormous failure. Just a few years ago, compressed natural gas was the way we were going to go. And suddenly today, it's electric cars. What was wrong with compressed natural gas? I think it had a lot of great things. If we leave the free market and clever people to do clever things and get rid of some of the subsidies that are out there, I think we'll be in a better position to achieve the right answer to this last problem. So that leads me with the last item back to fertilizer. The answer is natural gas. The Haber-Bosch process that was invented some 75, 80 years ago takes natural gas and converts it to the fertilizer that we throw around so cheaply and freely today. But without natural gas, we would only be able to feed, Vaclav-Smil estimates, about half of the world's population at best. So that is it for the presentation. I hope it wasn't too doom and gloom. And again, I do thank you for the invitation.
Here we are in the Robert H. Jackson Center, born in Spring Creek Township, Warren County, Pennsylvania. We have Art Stewart from Warren County, Pennsylvania. We have Art Stewart, who was formerly an attorney, and your father was also an attorney.
That's right.
There's actually somewhat of a connect. Your dad actually reached out to Jackson. What's that story?
We were cleaning out my mother's house, and we found a letter from my father writing to Justice Jackson, inviting him to a celebration of the Warren County Bar Association. Of course, Justice Jackson having been born in Spring Creek, it was a logical invitation. And a very nice note back from the justice saying that he regretted that he could not attend, but he bestowed his good wishes upon the Warren County Bar Association.
So talk about your dad. He was a lawyer, but was he a Warren County, was he born there, raised there?
No, he grew up in Indiana, Pennsylvania. He went to Penn State and obtained his degree in forestry, and my mother would say that he always wanted to be a forester, and the law was a jealous mistress. My dad would go to the law office in his yellow Woolrich pants, having come off the Christmas tree plantation that I grew up on, having been out in the morning working in the Christmas trees and then showing up at the office.
So, but was going into law, was that a natural thing for you to do?
No, not at all. My wife and I went to Allegheny College, and for our senior project, we wrote a musical together, and we had in mind that we would be good enough to do musicals as a career. So we moved to Pittsburgh. I went to Carnegie Mellon to take some music courses. We took a stab at writing, found out that we probably weren't in that top echelon. We had both been philosophy and theology majors. I was actually a child care worker down there to put food on the table, which was a very rewarding career, but not a long-term career, and it wasn't something that I saw myself doing for 20 years. So the idea to go to law school came upon me as a challenge, and so after a couple years in Pittsburgh, went to law school. It was a good idea. I loved the law, and I knew I wanted to move back to this area where I grew up because I didn't like the sidewalks in Pittsburgh. It dawned on me in Pittsburgh, my feet never touched the grass.
So at the University of Pittsburgh Law School, you graduate, you pass the bar, and say, hey, Dad, I'm coming home.
So Dad was deceased. He died in 1968 when I was 10. So I said to Mom, hey, I'm coming home, which I'm sure to Mom was an enormous relief, because now as a parent looking back, when I told my mom that I was going to be a philosophy and theology major, I can't imagine the angst that she had, wondering what was her son going to do as a philo and theo major. But I think she was a little relieved when I came back as a lawyer.
We know the history, you talked about it briefly, 1859, Edwin Drake also finding the first well in Titusville, excuse me, okay. And then here we are in West Pennsylvania. Was that of interest to you back then?
So on the school bus riding to Eisenhower High School, I passed all those wells and never had a clue how they operated. It wasn't until I got to law school that I took an interest in oil and gas, and I ended up, perhaps because of the professor, perhaps because I just knew I wanted to do something outdoors eventually, I took every class that I could in law school that involved minerals, and did my paper in law school on that subject. And then when I came back, entered a practice that did some work with oil and gas, and at that time, I entered practice in '85. That was the crash of the oil boom at that time. And in 1988, a gentleman came to the office and wanted to sell a 1,000-acre lease that had 13 broken down wells on it. And I knew I wanted to be outdoors. I knew I did not like shearing Christmas trees, having grown up in that. And I thought to myself, this is something that I am interested in. So I didn't have a clue how the wells worked. I, out of the blue, called a gentleman that was recommended to me that knew how wells worked. I called him up on a cold call, said, would you like to get in the oil and gas business? And we went out and looked at the wells. We knew they needed a service rig. He knew of a rig that was for sale for $8,500. We bought the lease for $50,000. We borrowed $58,500. Had my mom co-sign the note, post her house as
She was
collateral,
thrilled that you came back, I'm sure.
and off we went.
Yeah, my golly. So, you practiced law for a period of time, but ultimately you formed D&I Silica. Was there an aha moment where you decided you'd really leave the dark side and enter into the corporate world?
So the end of the practice of law was gradual. I was working weekends and evenings for years. We never took money out of, I never took a penny out of the company for the first 12 years. But there came a time, roughly around 2000, when the price of oil started to come up and I did that large borrowing that I spoke about. Started to take a little bit of money out, and that's when I began to slow down the law practice. The D&I story is a really interesting story. I bought a company out of bankruptcy in Phoenix, Arizona. It was an oil and gas company. I bought it in 2004. There were 20-some creditors that I had to placate in that, and one of the creditors was a gentleman, a very astute man, who wanted, as his pacification, if you will, for me to drill him 10 wells at cost, which I agreed to. I agreed with all the creditors, some accommodation. He came out to see his wells completed, and he had his hand in the sand that was going into the well, and he came to me and he said, I can get you better frac sand than this. And he was dressed in clothes that didn't belong in the oil patch, and I basically said, who are you to tell me that? But he proved his credibility. He'd grown up in the mineral business, and he really knew what he was talking about. And there was a need at that time for hydrofracture sand. It was in short supply. And so standing on that frac truck that day, essentially the seeds were planted to do a boutique business just to bring in sand for the local need. And that first year, the travails of starting any business, but we sold 7 rail cars of sand, to make a long story short. It was touch and go. I was in charge of operations. He was in charge of sand supply. And then a former client of our firm was Terry Pagula, who now owns the Bills and so forth. Terry came down to visit me one day and said, what are you doing in the Marcellus? And I said, nothing. And he said, well, what's the real deal, Arthur? You should get into it. I didn't want to go do the Marcellus. I like just living here, and I like my little corridor. But the sand business was a way that we could sell shovels to miners, if you will. And so I related this conversation to my partner, and he said, let's go target the Marcellus as a market for our sand. And so we were the first people to get massive rail sites around Pennsylvania. And we basically beat the crowd to the door, if you will. And so we got a great site over in the eastern part of the state, and then I went down and scouted a site in the southern part of the state, and we locked up these marvelous sites for bringing sand in by rail. Then we got ahead of the competition by having the idea to build silos, and we were really cutting edge of the technology back at the time to move sand, and it took enormous amounts of sand. So that's how we got into that.
What's the source of sand? I mean, we think of sand, sandy beaches, but obviously they're all different. Where does one mine it so that it's available?
It's a great question. The only sand that's good comes from Wisconsin and Illinois because it has to be round for the molecules of oil and gas to pass through it. If you think of a column of pipe that you wanted to run water through and you had to put something in it, you put marbles in it, the water will go down through. But if you put square sand in it, the water will have a hard time percolating through that. So you have to frack or hydrofracture with round sand. And in Wisconsin and Illinois, eons ago, that was a shallow ocean on this continent, and it was quartz rock underneath. And that ocean worked that quartz, and so you have monogranular grains of quartz sand that were washed back and forth by that ocean that turned them into these round grains. And it's literally all over Wisconsin and Illinois.
So your business would go out and lease mining sites and essentially, and then run it by rail to certain locations in Pennsylvania where you would park it and put it in silos and then in turn truck it, I assume, to the sites?
We didn't involve ourselves in the trucking. We were a wholesale supplier, and we bought from existing mines, and then we invested in a mine. But you described the business spot on.
Yeah. Did you ever guess that you'd be in the sand business?
No. No, life has these funny turns, and it's an accident of being in the right place at the right time. But what a great experience. I got a doctorate in business through the School of Hard Knocks. We did seven-figure deals in the course of that business. Who grows up thinking they're going to do, 100 million? I guess that's 9 figures, sorry. We did a $100 million deal with one purchaser, which is an experience to be had. It was bizarre.
So while you dropped a name, Terry Pagula, who rides high in western New York, what kind of guy is he?
Terry is just a great down-to-earth man. He always wanted to own a hockey team, and he's one of those people on earth who went out and achieved his goal. I admired Terry greatly when he was a client at our law firm, and I admire him today. I suspect he's the same Terry that I knew 30 years ago.
And you died a few deaths a few Sundays ago in that football game, as did Terry.
Oh, what a heartbreaker. I'm sorry for Terry.
So your Energy Reflections program was a master class. I should have taken you at Allegheny College giving that class. It was terrific. Do you find in putting this together, you've actually learned much more about a business of which you are currently in by just teaching this and conveying this? Have you found this to be a skilled opportunity for you?
I'll answer that by saying what I find most remarkable is the general lack of knowledge about the thing that is so central to our lives, namely energy. Mm-hmm. The misconceptions that exist out there, the different answers I get, for example, at Thanksgiving, when I ask people, how much energy do we use? And then when I tell them it's 100 million barrels a day around the earth, and then I say to them, suppose we turned everything on that we could in the next 6 months, how much would it be that we could produce? And the answers range from 100 million barrels to 200 million barrels. And of course the answer is about 100 million barrels. We can only produce about what we consume. But the notion that people could be off by that enormous amount for something that's so critical to us, I'm continually shocked by that.
Are you continually shocked also just by listening to various news items and newscasts or podcasts dealing with the arrival of green energy as the ultimate, as the goal, and almost therefore by the contrary, the fossil fuel becomes the black knight. It's got to bother you.
It does bother me that we make fossil fuels out to be so evil, because no one has a sense of what it would be like to be without fossil fuels. On my website I have an article that I wrote about chopping wood. And, women just 150 years ago, the average woman walked 150 miles a year to carry water. Basically, 80% of the people were involved in shoveling manure. And you didn't stay warm unless you chopped wood. And we're so disconnected from that we're free to turn around and denigrate fossil fuels, the very thing that keeps us warm and fed. And we're supplanting it with this I heard it called the other day techno-fantasy about wind and solar. It is a fantasy to think that that's going to come in and be without consequence and be scalable and be cheap and be without any negative consequences. I'm an advocate for all kinds of energy, but I hope I'm a realistic advocate and that we should look at the problems realistically. So yes, I'm continually shocked by those very things.
So you're on The Price is Right. Arthur Stewart, come on down. And all of a sudden, you hit the magic marker, you win the grand prize, and they say, Art Stewart, you just won a Tesla car. Will you accept that?
Well, of course I would accept it, but I would be realistic about the problems. The Tesla car would work great in California for short trips, but the battery is about 40% less efficient when we reach freezing, and it continues to degrade as we go below freezing. So I would know that up here in the northern climes, I might be better off to sell that Tesla to a California resident.
Recently, on Fox Business News, there was an hour-long section on how America works, featuring Cameron Energy. It's a great watch. I was so proud. There's Western New York. Those are covering your work and your son and family. It was remarkable. How did that happen? What's the genesis of being on national television? How does that work?
Yeah, talk about a cold call. So apparently the backstory is they reached out to the majors, Shell, Exxon, and so forth, and those companies turned them away, and somehow they got onto our website. And so we got this call from a producer who said, hey, I'm looking at your website. It looks fantastic. And we'd like to know if you'd be willing to do a show, which sounded like a crank call to us. And we were reluctant because of the very thing you talked about. The way that oil and gas is portrayed as evil is something we fight against all the time. So then they told us it was Mike Rowe. Mike seems to be a very credible person in the way he presents the folks on Dirty Jobs. And that was probably the thing that tipped the scale for us.
So it's How America Works, Fracking in Western Pennsylvania. Now, they just don't come out and spend one day. It sounded like just in the course of the special interview they had, Fox Business News had with you and your son, John, yeah, about that. There was a lot going on. Could you tell us some of the stuff behind the scenes?
Sure. It was an amazing process. They came down in April of last year, get this, for 9 days straight.
Oh, gosh.
And they took over 80 hours of video, which some poor soul out west had to edit down to the 44 or 42 minutes of airtime. And before they came, they asked us to give them 5 or 6 plot narratives of problems that would exist in real life and how those things would be resolved. And so when they came down, they had a script of things that they wanted to see, not a script of what we would say. They never scripted a single word. But we told them, you know, you could come to a hydrofracture operation and you'll see this. So they wanted to see that. Then they wanted to see a well tender do his thing or her thing. And that's how the script, if you will, was put together by them. But here's the interesting thing. We had some real live problems that occurred while they were here. A drilling rig got terribly stuck. And they came over and they filmed that for hours. And we had guys under the rig and we had a bulldozer there and an excavator there. Never made the program. It just didn't fit the narrative that they wanted to tell.
But part of that narrative, though, you had a hard time getting through the original frack, you know, because you had all kinds of stuff pounded, and because you couldn't break it. I mean, you couldn't overload it. That was fascinating.
Yeah, those problems unfortunately happen with some regularity. We can't predict when they're going to happen. Fortunately, those things unfolded for the camera, so it worked out well. I mean, but they're there the whole time, filming for hour after hour. Some of it's very, very boring stuff. That running out of fuel,
Yeah.
that, I have to say, that wasn't my staff. That was the contractor, but it sort of got blamed on us. But neither here nor there. It all worked out well, but that was as genuine could be.
Well, likewise, when the tree, I mean, you had a windstorm and all of a sudden, there's a lot of power. I mean, you're tending, I was very impressed. It's 1,600 wells. And these are your own wells, or do you manage other people's wells?
No, they're our own wells. Cameron Energy, we started humbly with 13, and just somehow over the years, some days I go to work and I pinch myself. We have almost 45, I think we have 43 or 44 employees, and I love them dearly, and I drive into this great office that has this great vista, and there's some oil wells in the yard of the office, and the dogs are running around, and I live this blessed life, and my children come to work with me, and my wife comes to work, and I count myself incredibly fortunate.
And I must add, this is a personal touch, Art, and some of your employees have been, you permitted them to work on a project for the Robert Jackson Center at the Robert H. Jackson Homestead in Spring Creek. And trust me, that, for some who want to go on YouTube and watch how that's progressed, that would not have happened but for Cameron Energy's people, including Art Stewart, Mr. CEO, physically out there using a brush hog and all this stuff. It was incredible. So I thank you publicly for that amazing addition. I don't think we're quite done yet, but we're getting there.
That was our pleasure to do that. That is the hardest thing now. I hate to ask employees to do things that I won't do, and I used to stand on the rig floor and wrench pipe, probably the hardest job out there. But now if I go to try to pick up a wrench, I have a fleet of young men who come in and grab it, and they just won't stand to see me out there doing anything. They take it as a personal insult if I step out there, so that's kind of humorous.
So I take it you don't miss the practice of law?
No, I'm a happy, recovering attorney. It was a great profession, but it's a very stressful profession. Not that this isn't, but carrying the burden, well, you know it, carrying the burden of clients is a tough thing.
What was the feedback of this wonderful program that aired September 28th, by the way, September 28th, 2021, for those who want to Google around and see it? What kind of feedback did you get?
There's a couple clips on YouTube. If you can't catch the program, you Google How America Works, Cameron Energy, and there's a couple great clips. We got feedback on our website from all over the country, and I think it was universally positive. People saying, wow, we didn't know it was that difficult. Thanks for sharing. Of course, there were some industry folks that wrote in and said, great presentation for how the industry actually works. Thanks for doing that. But in the main, people were saying, wow, there's just so much more to it than we knew.
Reading the Wall Street Journal recently, this past week, oil prices hit 7-year high on worries about supply. A similar one talked about potentially $100 per barrel. That's predicted, forecast rise for return of $100 barrel of oil. Is that how you sense it?
Mm-hmm. When the crash came in 2014 and 2015, there were a lot of articles out there that said we'll never see $100 oil again. I clipped those and have them on my computer because I'm certain that we will see that. For a lot of the reasons that I talked about, there are supply worries, and probably a high price will mitigate those in the near term, but in the long term, most school children, I hope, know that fossil fuels are finite. And so in the long scale of human history, that means something significant.
How close do you follow, I mean, this is an obvious question, softball, but what's going on internationally? I mean, for a period of time, the United States became independent of OPEC. Now, perhaps we're much more mindful of what's going on today than perhaps we were just a few years ago. Does that worry you?
It does. I think you're seeing it play out in Europe right now, and what worries me is the hostage-like nature of the energy predicament. So the United Kingdom and mainland Europe are hostage on the electricity front to the Russians, because Germany gets almost all of its natural gas, which is used to generate electricity in Germany, in pretty much the same percentages that we saw in the UK. In other words, the greatest contributor to electricity in Germany is natural gas. And they're beholden to the Russians there. And our politics in this country for decades has centered around the Middle East, and we're held hostage by those politics. We have a navy for that purpose. And we became free of those politics for a little while we were energy independent, but I think we're drifting back into that hostage situation.
Western Pennsylvania, the heartbeat of the original Edwin Drake well. And since then, you've been part of and enjoyed the successes of hydrofracking in Pennsylvania, which is well known, which spread into other areas in the country. But Pennsylvania certainly was the hotbed, and you were the right place, right time. What's the state of hydrofracking now in Pennsylvania?
I guess we could answer that on two fronts. Quantitatively, how much is going on, and environmentally, what is the story? Quantitatively, there's just as much hydrofracturing going on today as there has been for the last several years. There was a curve that looked like this, and then it's essentially plateaued, and that's hydrofracturing primarily for natural gas, which is the product that shale yields almost exclusively here in Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of hydrofracturing going on. Environmentally, you had a lot of fuss and notoriety with water contamination. You saw that picture that Josh, somebody or another, had that movie where you could light the faucet. Mm-hmm. But if you dig deeper on that, you'll find that you could light those faucets before hydrofracturing, and it's really hard to come up with evidence of any wide-scale environmental fallout from the hydrofracturing. We can get into the reasons why on that, but it's much fuss about not much, if any, impact. And the true story of that is told with hydrofracturing having this long history dating all the way back to the 1960s, as I mentioned in my presentation. We forget about that. But we all grew up here in western New York and Pennsylvania with hydrofractured wells in our backyards, in our schoolyards, and we didn't take note of them until they became notorious.
Yeah. Well, off camera, we'll talk about, I too was, representing a lot of oil and gas companies, which you'd go out to a hydrofracturing moment, it was kind of fun.
Sure.
Exactly. You talked a little about comparison with wind and solar. Wind and solar really make only economic sense when, in fact, as they're developing it, they have in their back pocket a power purchase agreement.
Right.
I mean, that's the gold for them to determine whether, when, and how they're going to implement a project. In a oil, gas development project, is there much more of a risk? They don't have power purchase agreements necessarily, do they?
That is probably the most astute question I've ever been asked about energy. And here's a fascinating two-part answer.
Can you capture that, Ed? Let's make sure we get that down.
So here's a two-part answer. Wind and solar are subsidized in two ways. One is really obvious, and that is simply the cash that goes to that industry. The second subsidy is what you just asked about, and nobody ever talks about, but I'm delighted to talk about it. And it's this. Electricity companies are obliged to buy the electricity generated from wind and solar by those contracts that you're talking about. That's a very good posture for the wind and solar companies, but think what that does to the other suppliers of electricity, like the natural gas plants or the coal plants or the nuclear plants. It puts them in the lower tier of the lousy place to be, where they have to throttle up and throttle down to be the buffer for what the wind and solar can't supply. And there's an enormous cost that goes untalked about with that obligation to always be the go-to supplier. So natural gas, because you can turn it on and off, it's the go-to supplier that fills the gaps, because you always have to run at that 110 volts or you blow up the computer or the microwave. And that's the obligation of the grid. And when wind and solar coming on and off whenever the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, they're constantly going up and down, as you saw in the presentation. But we have to accommodate for them. And that's the unfairness. That's that second subsidy. That's what makes your question so astute. Over in my business, no, there's no contract. There's no guarantee that I'm going to get paid any price. And so I suffered moving from $110 oil in 2014 to dropping down to negative 37 at one day, but flopping along at $30 oil for a lot of years there. And imagine if you're in a business and your income drops by 75%. That is a tough thing.
Do you have choices who buys your oil? I mean,
Not really. Our oil is lubricating quality, and so refineries can only lubricate or only refine they're set up to refine certain grades of oil. So our refining quality oil has to go to a refinery our lubricating quality oil has to go to a refinery that's set up for that. So there are two. The world's oldest continuously operating refinery in Bradford is ARG, and then Ergon in West Virginia. So those are the two refineries that we can sell to.
United Refining, isn't that one of those?
No, United Refining refines about 60,000 barrels a day, and all of that oil comes from Canada. You'll notice their advertisements are very carefully crafted to say, North American, we're proud to refine North American oil. Comes through a pipeline down from New York.
No idea.
Comes across Grand Island from
Yeah.
Canada and down that way. So there's a tiny amount of Western Pennsylvania crude that goes to United, but it's infinitesimal.
Yeah. Yes, it's phenomenal. I've learned so much here, Art. This is fantastic. Now, you knew obviously you were coming. We talked about this for a few months, and in anticipation of today, is there a question you expected me to ask that I haven't asked?
No, this was, when you have the most astute question ever asked of me, I think we have to say that's top flight.
Well, with that, we're going to draw closure, but thank you very much, Art, for sharing all this. And this will be shared for the audience's sake. This will be on YouTube, and our Turner Winter Series, once again, as a highlight. Art Stewart, thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Appreciate it.